Sacred Geometry Foundation Training Series Companion Book Table of Contents DVD Transcript ... 1 Transcript Table of Contents 3 Lecture DVD 1 5 Lecture DVD 2 47 Lecture DVD 3 85 Inner Development Practices DVD 111 Foundation Training Course Handout 135 Handoutable of Contents 137 Resource List ... 187 Resource List Table of Contents 189 LLL Sacred Geometry Lecture DVDs and Inner Development Practice DVD. This DVD series contains excerpts from a Live Sacred Geometry Foundation training taught by Dr. Robert J. Gilbert. The training was held August 2004 in Asheville, NC. The following transcripts have been edited for clarity. However, it is still necessary to view the DVDs to see the important illustrations which accompany these discussions, in order to fully understand the context of the topics discussed in the transcripts. L. Transcripts of DVDs Table of Contents Lecture DVD 1 I5 Chapter 1, Introduction 7 Chapter 2, Information Resource Guide 9 Chapter 3, The Need for an Adult Education Program in Metaphysics 11 Chapter 4, The Spiritual Foundations of Sacred Geometry 13 Chapter 5, The Alphabet of Creation 17 Chapter 6, Squaring the Circle 21 Chapter 7, Higher Dimensions 23 Chapter 8, The Three-Dimensional World and the Cube of Space 25 Chapter 9, The Cosmic Context of Space and Time 27 Chapter 10, The Earth's Primary Measure of Space and Time 31 Chapter 11, The Three Logos Microcosm, Macrocosm, and the Godhead 35 Chapter 12, The Four Worlds of Creation and the Four Bodies of the Human Being 37 Chapter 13, The Cosmicity of the Human Subtle Bodies, 137 and 12 39 Lecture DVD 2. 47 Chapter 1, The Blueprint of Creation 49 Chapter 2, The Masters of the Net 51 Chapter 3, Passage through Higher Worlds, the Seven Heavenly Halls times 55 Chapter 4, Hieroglyphs, Numbers and Symbols 57 Chapter 5, EGYJ: and Temple Concepts 59 Chapter 6, The Hebrew Tradition 61 Chapter 7, Structuring the Human Subtle Body 65 Chapter 8, Kabbalistic Net Diagram 67 Chapter 9, Jewish Kabbalistic Sacred Geometry 69 Chapter 10, The Masters of the Net in Greece 73 Chapter 11, New Testament Times 79 Chapter 12, The Neph in the European Holy Grail Tradition 83 Lecture DVD 3. 85 Chapter 1, Rotation Activating the Power of the Center 87 3. Chapter 2, Resonance and Geometric Resonance 89 Chapter 3, Shape Caused Waves 91 Chapter 4, Polarity Balancing. 93 Chapter 5, Interface. 93 Chapter 6, Clockwise and Counterclockwise Spin Patterns. 95 Chapter 7, Energy Quality of Number. 97 Chapter 8, Grail Points. 97 Chapter 9, Organic Architecture. 99 Chapter 10, Form expresses function / spiritual essence. 99 Chapter 11, Morphology Time Sequences in Space. 101 Chapter 12, The Jelly Mold Physical Geometries as Imprints of the Etheric. 101 Chapter 13, Sacred Geometry as Visible Vibration / Sound. 103 Chapter 14, The Power of Length. 107 Chapter 15, The Power of Fungal. 109 Chapter 16, Circuit, Effective, and Symbolic Diagrams. 109 Inner Development Practices DVD 1. 111 Chapter 1, Structuring the Human Subtle Body. 113 Chapter 2, Introducing the Descending Technique. 115 Chapter 3, The Friction Breathing Technique. 119 Chapter 4, Descending Practice. 123 Chapter 5, Questions and Answers. 127 4. Sacred Geometry, Essential Background Teachings Lecture DVD 1 Chapter 1, Introduction, 7 Chapter 2, Information Resource Guide. 9 Chapter 3, The Need for an Adult Education Program in Metaphysics. 11 Chapter 4, The Spiritual Foundations of Sacred Geometry. 13 Chapter 5, The Alphabet of Creation. 17 Chapter 6, Squaring the Circle. 21 Chapter 7, Higher Dimensions. 23 Chapter 8, The Three-Dimensional World and the Cube of Space. 25 Chapter 9, The Cosmic Context of Space and Time. 27 Chapter 10, The Earth's Primary Measure of Space and Time. 31 Chapter 11, The Three Logos Microcosm, Macrocosm, and the Godhead. Chapter 12, The Four Worlds of Creation and the Four Bodies of the Human Being. 37 Chapter 13, The Cosmic Code of the Human Subtle Bodies, 1, 3, 7 and 12. 39 5. Chapter 1, Introduction. Hello, I'm Robert Gilbert. I will be the primary instructor for this coming week. My involvement with sacred geometry really began in the early 1980s when I joined the US Marine Corps and I was made an instructor in nuclear, biological and chemical warfare survival, NBC defense. At that time I began to study nuclear, biological and chemical systems. What I quickly discovered is that, although these are primarily taught in the way of very complex mathematical formulae, behind all natural systems on this planet are pure geometry. So as I began to study all these natural systems from the perspective of pure geometry, I found in time that this knowledge is in fact very ancient. I never heard the term sacred geometry until after I had left the military many years later. But I had already found that many of the same patterns found in nuclear physics, chemistry, and biology had been known to the ancient mystery schools. So I then spent 12 years getting my doctorate in international studies and studying many different traditions around the world, trying to pull together their geometric knowledge to see how all these patterns of creation fit together. My perspective is that every spiritual tradition in the world holds a piece of the puzzle. I am going to try to lay that out for you a little bit this weekend. All these different spiritual traditions have a unique perspective on this core mystery of how the physical world is created from spirit. Sacred geometry is, in a sense, the coding system of how spirit creates the manifest world. So again, our perspective is going to be that every tradition has something to offer. What you FMD in one tradition might be complementary to, but very different from, another tradition. But put them all together and there is something in the center they are all looking at, like the classic metaphor of the blind men and the elephant. If you get all the perspectives together, you can figure out what is that core thing. So that is going to be our approach for this weekend. Because some of you are only here for this weekend and others of you are here for the entire week, we have structured it so that the weekend is a self-contained unit, but it works as an introduction for those who are here for the entire week. The opening weekend, today and tomorrow, we are going to take a look at an overall context for sacred geometry. We are going to look at many different spiritual traditions and a few of their key pieces of sacred geometry. We are also going to take a look at some vital principles which make sacred geometry effective, principles that are not discussed publicly very much. We find that people come to this seminar for very different reasons. We have put together this training so that we touch on many different aspects of sacred geometry, two-dimensional drafting, three-dimensional construction, physical and energetic movement, meditative work, and of course a lot of the knowledge base, the fundamental information that goes into sacred geometry. But I know that some people came here looking for very specific things, while other people are generalists and want the big picture. I have been to a lot of different sacred geometry workshops taught by different instructors, and I have seen what I felt worked and what didn't work. One thing I always wanted is this: if I'm going to be told about some type of sacred geometric form or pattern, I need to see it. And so we have worked really hard to put together a presentation where all the primary concepts are 7. Illustrated. Therefore, a lot of the presentation is going to be with slides, so for everything I am referring to, you can actually see the pattern. It is really essential in working with sacred geometry, whether you are doing the two-dimensional drafting or the three-dimensional construction, or you are just studying the information from the different spiritual schools or technical information from scientific work, to really get a sense of the impact of the form itself. This process has to do with the holistic mind, the intuitive mind, working with the form itself. We are going to give you a lot of very specific intellectual information, but there is something about the forms themselves which have an effect. The forms actually have an effect on the mind, they have an effect on our energy field, they have an effect on our consciousness. Later we will go into more detail about that. 8. Chapter 2, Information Resource Guide. One frustration which I have often had when going to seminars on different spiritual topics or on sacred geometry, is that a lot of fascinating things get mentioned but I don't always know where it came from. Did the teacher FMD it out? Is it the teacher's proprietary knowledge? Did it come from a book somewhere? Did it come from another tradition? And if we didn't have time to deal with it in detail in that course, where can I go to get more information? So I have done my best here to try to lay out some foundations of knowledge, because what we are doing with this course is creating a synthesis, pulling the pieces together. To be honest, there is a lot of information available, as you see with all the books and tapes and things listed in the back of your handout binder. A lot of information is available related to sacred geometry. However, it tends to be piecemeal, just little bits and pieces all over the place. Particular texts might have one incredible piece of information hidden on page 56, which helps make sense of all this other material. But just looking at the book from the outside, you might not even know that critical piece of information is in there. So what we have done here, in the resource guide, is to lay out particular topics, and I then list the texts connected to it. We have split it up so that for each particular topic area the first part lists books which we carry at Vasica, books that you can order from us, that are available. Then the next part is resources that we do not carry, that are either very hard to get hold of, or they are rare, out of print, that sort of thing, but that we feel are important to know about. And if you are interested in a specific topic, The important texts related to that topic are listed so that you can learn more about your topic. Also, with the resource guide that we have here, some things are simply listed by title. Others include a short description. For other resources we then go further, when it says look for, I have noted some particular things in that book that are particularly significant within the context of what we will be describing in this course. A lot of that significance will fall into place later in the week, because some aspects we don't even get to until the end of the week. We are going to go through a process starting on Monday when we deal with the circle, the sphere, and the torus, things of that nature. On Tuesday we get into projective geometry and ideas about polarity. We move into working with the vortex, spiral energies, a number of different things. We will then move forward into two-dimensional form, three-dimensional form, the Earth grid, etc. So some of the things noted in the resource list as look for indicate texts which provide more information on topics which we will be touching on. Then finally, for some of the headings, you will see in capital letters esoteric discussion. The esoteric discussion is for anyone who is interested in some deeper spiritual aspects of what is presented here. A lot of it is related to my own background in Rosicrucianism, because that is the aspect I know the best. However, not all of it is. Some of you have done several workshops with me at an earlier time, such as the Rosicrucian series of workshops, others have done biogeometry, etc. So some of the things I allude to under esoteric discussion are making connections between what is in the text described, and some important topics we have touched on in other workshops. So that is the basic layout of what is in the resource guide, so that you know where to go for more information. 9. Chapter 3, the need for an adult education program in metaphysics. We have put together this training so that we can try in a clear, concise manner to pull together pieces of knowledge from all over the place. It is my belief that, once again, there is a lot of information available, not just in sacred geometry, but also in spiritual work. It can be very difficult to pull it all together into some type of cohesive whole, to have a sense of context. To me, it is a tragedy that the ancient knowledge in the spiritual schools, the portion of the whole held by a particular school, was taught only to a small, closed group of initiates and was never shared outside of that situation. As time moved forward and we arrived at our CUJ 10th point in human evolution, that information is now beginning to become public. But it has become public in a fragmented fashion. Since that is so, we really need to FMD a way to see it in its totality, to see it in its true context. So that is what we are attempting to do with this training, to make this treasure of knowledge accessible, and save people the difficulty of having to recreate the wheel. Sometimes I hear from someone who has worked on a particular esoteric project for 5 or 10 years, and they have finally come to the point where they discovered something incredible. Then I regret having to tell them that information was already available, only they never knew about it. What if they could have known that specific, and useful, information in the first 6 months of their study, then where would they be now, 10 years down the road? And I think that is where we are at today in modern metaphysics. We have come to that place where a lot of information has become available, but still there are not many resources which pull the pieces together and tell you explicitly that this tradition has that piece of information, this source has this other piece, to put it all together so you have a well-rounded understanding. I think IJ is possible now for us to have a form of adult education in metaphysics which is non-dogmatic, which is non-sectarian, and which gives you an overview of what information is held where so that you know where to start your studies. And in a fairly short period of time, we can get people to a much higher level of knowledge, so they can move forward into whatever it is that they are here to do. Our philosophy at Vesica is that I am not trying to train you to simply do something the way that I do it, because you are not me. You are not here to do what I came to do. Many of you have very specific interests, and, according to my philosophy, particular spiritual tasks or trajectories that you are on which you need to develop further. My job is to try to give you enough contextual knowledge to move ahead in your own direction as quickly as possible. You are going to do something with this knowledge which may be very different from what I am going to do with it. In many cases, you may do with it things which I could never even imagine. There is a coding system of creation, to which absolutely everything connects. So even if we don't deal with your specific area of interest explicitly in this course, we will nonetheless be talking about the foundations of that area of interest as it relates to sacred geometry and the patterns of creation. 11. Chapter 4, The Spiritual Foundations of Sacred Geometry. Sacred geometry means literally the sacred measure of the earth. When we talk about sacred geometry, you can find different workshops where different instructors approach sacred geometry from very different perspectives. One of the primary perspectives you will find is the tradition of sacred geometry approached through two-dimensional drafting practices. This tradition is often called the Masters of the Compass. Probably the best-known representative of this tradition today is Keith Critchlow in Britain. A lot of his work has also been popularized through his student Robert Lawler, C. Lawler's Sacred Geometry, Philosophy and Practice. So what UFMD are these classical representations are similar to this is one by William Blake, where the Godhead in an initial sphere is then reaching down with the compass to create a perfect circle or a sphere in which creation will be held. The sphere is the perfect form containing the Godhead in the spiritual world, and then he reaches down to create a sphere as a container for the material world. And so in sacred geometry what we are really doing is learning the system by which the Godhead, and divine spiritual beings, manifested everything into the creation that we see around us. This mystery of creation is alluded to in every great spiritual tradition. In a sense it is the great spiritual question: how did a non-physical spiritual world create a manifest physical world? How does that work? How does one move from the non-manifest to the manifest, and back again? How do you go from what in the Hindu tradition is called Arupa, the formless, into the world of Rupa, or form? That process is really learning the divine language of sacred geometry known to the higher spiritual hierarchies. Human initiates are learning the very same creation processes. This manifests in many different ways, in alchemy, in healing, in sacred architecture, many different ways. So we have the form of the circle or sphere as the first form of creation, and mastering the compass as one of the first steps in this particular approach to sacred geometry. We are going to be doing practical work with the compass this weekend. One of the major things you are going to FMD is that the compass allows you to create a perfect circle, because most of us cannot create a perfect circle freehand. Leonardo da Vinci could, but most of us cannot make a perfect circle unless we use the compass. Because with the compass, you put the point down in the very center first. There is an important spiritual principle here. By holding a center steady, you can then create a perfect circle. That is all the compass does, it anchors a center, and from that center you can create the perfect circle. Those of you who have studied with me, or with Dr. Ibrahim Karim, the work of biogeometry know that when you create a circular or semicircular movement, the very center of that movement will emanate specific spiritual energies. In biogeometry we call these profound spiritual energies the biogeometry 3, or BG3, namely the higher harmonic of gold, the higher harmonic of ultraviolet, and a carrier wave the French identified as negative green. Many of you here are very familiar with this already. We will talk about it a little bit more later on. 13. Note, for more information on biogeometry and the energies it works with, see the book Egyptian-European Energy Work by Dr. Robert J. Gilbert and the biogeometry trainings offered by Vasika. The basic idea is that forms are also related to energetic emission. This is a very important thing in sacred geometry. The forms of sacred geometry are not purely philosophical, they are not simply symbolic. Very often when you study sacred geometry, at least in the kind of academic classical sense, everything is represented as symbolic. A 6-pointed star represents this, a 5-pointed star represents that, the circle represents something else. Certainly that is true at one level, but sacred geometry as it is understood in the great spiritual traditions of the world is really an energy science. Sacred geometry forms create specific energies, they structure energy to perform specific functions. They are not just symbolic in an abstract sense. So one of the ideas in sacred geometry is that we are actually looking through the manifest world to see the patterns and the processes which stand behind it. From this context, what we have today with modern science is in fact a slow piecemeal rediscovery, from a rather materialistic perspective, of parts of the knowledge of the great spiritual schools. What I mean by that, is that when I was studying with the US military about biological, chemical, and nuclear systems, the patterns that I found being referred to in some of the most advanced studies of natural systems were the same patterns known and taught in the great spiritual schools of the past. But these things are almost never taught publicly. In the past it was always kept in closed groups. So what modern science has done is, through empirical research, rediscovered those patterns. That is fantastic because we are able to identify a lot of important information this way, but it is catastrophic because modern science has no holistic spiritual context for the pieces, the patterns of spiritual creation, it has rediscovered. The great spiritual schools understood those pieces in a particular holistic context. For example, the Greek tradition publicly taught 4 of the 5 Platonic solids, which are the perfect three-dimensional forms. The 5th form, however, they were not allowed to teach publicly. The 5th form they said was the form of the ether and has to do with how a person connects to vital life force. We are going to go into details on this topic around Thursday, when we deal with three-dimensional sacred geometry forms. I then found models in the nuclear from a particular professor emeritus at the University of Chicago, Robert Moon, who had worked on the Manhattan Project, models that demonstrated one of the keys to nuclear science. The same form that the Greeks would not teach publicly, the dodecahedron, is also the form which was used to contain the first nuclear bomb. The first nuclear weapon, and I will show you a picture of this Thursday, is in the form of a dodecahedron. That was not an accident. It was not just a coincidence. The Greeks said because this form is related to vital life force itself, if it was to be misused it could create catastrophic consequences. And we have seen that play out in modern history. That is just one example for you of what I mean when I say that modern science has rediscovered pieces of the old sacred geometry knowledge of the great spiritual schools of the past. I am a big believer in science. But I am a believer in a science that is holistic and includes all aspects of reality, and not simply the type of reductionist science that we have today. Science today is essentially a kind of religion, a religion that excludes anything metaphysical a priori. And that approach leads to a lot of problems. 14. So from a spiritual perspective, what is sacred geometry? One aspect of it is that sacred geometry forms are thought forms of the Godhead. This is one of the most important aspects for me. These forms are literally the thoughts of the Godhead which manifest into all the aspects of creation, all the things of the world. What this means is that the Godhead's thoughts move down through what spiritual traditions refer to as the planes of existence. At different planes these forms manifest or crystallize in different ways. At a very high spiritual plane, that geometric form, because the geometry is simply a pattern, it simply shows you how things fit together or how things work, that pattern will manifest as a conscious living being. At a lower level of manifestation, there are also specific geometric patterns behind every part of the human physical body, and there are specific geometric patterns behind every part of the human energetic body. These sacred geometry patterns actually manifest as conscious spiritual beings at a higher level of spirit. Then the patterns will manifest all aspects of creation in the physical, manifest world. Because of this geometric basis of creation, many spiritual traditions will communicate initiation knowledge through geometric diagrams. In these traditions they will often not describe the meaning of the diagram, but merely show a complex geometric form. I will show you many of these in this week, and by studying them you can begin to understand these archetypal thoughts on higher spiritual planes. Also, in advanced spiritual work you will FMD that spiritual beings are communicating not in a human language, but through geometric thoughts. So people in meditation, or in dreams, will begin to receive geometric images. This is a universal process. Often they do not know what those geometries mean. They think, I see this pattern, I see that pattern, I know it means something, but what? In many cases those geometries are alive and mobile, not just static forms. The form itself is alive, it is breathing, and it metamorphoses from one form to another. There is actually a science behind this. We are going to try to detail some of this during this week. There is a lawful progression from one form to another form. You know how it works, then you have a living model of how things manifest and move from one stage to the next stage. So we have to develop the capacity at a higher level of spiritual initiation or in sacred geometry work, to be able to receive what I am going to refer to as a packed thought form. Thanks to Dr. Samuel Sagan of the Clear Vision School for that term and concept. Everyone in this room has experienced a packed thought form at some time. This term refers to those times in which you get a tremendous amount of information in an instantaneous transfer. It just takes a moment. If you were to try to communicate the information completely to another person, it might take you days or weeks. You could never really completely do it. You got the information in an instant, but there is so much content in it that to unpack it into words, to express it to another person, takes a long time. So virtually every spiritual tradition talks about transmission. Energies can be transmitted from master to student, packed thought forms can be transmitted from master to student. It could never really be done just through speech. So we have to develop the capacity to perceive a packed thought form, and to get into its geometry in order to understand its meaning. This is connected to another important concept we will be dealing with, Grail points. For me, a Grail point is a place in the manifest world, or it could be in the human body, where a divine essence enters the physical world. The chakra system or the acupuncture system of points, for 15. Example, I see as being Grail points, because a Grail is a receptacle for a divine essence. This is true for the chakras, for the acupuncture points, for many other more esoteric concepts. The reason I am telling you this now is that there are particular practices taught in some traditions which have to do with becoming aware of where those Grail points are in the human energy field, becoming conscious in those areas, and then directly perceiving packed thought forms through focusing on those areas as places to receive the thought forms. Many of these centers are directly above the human head in the central column of energy. Now this idea of the thought forms of God comes to the West through ancient Greek philosophy, as does much of our sacred geometric knowledge. Plato popularized the concept of these ideas or ideal types or archetypes, which are a sort of high-level blueprint for every manifest thing in the physical world. These are often the tenets an academics use. In fact, in the Greek Pythagorean school, as you might have heard, they would say that initiation is impossible without an understanding of geometry. The great gift of sacred geometry for me, in terms of spiritual studies and working with people from so many different traditions, is that sacred geometry provides a common language for us all. All spiritual traditions work with these forms. So while there are different terminologies and ways of approaching the work, nonetheless everybody recognizes those forms. Sacred geometry gives you a way to connect and see the underlying patterns. 16. Chapter 5. The Alphabet of Creation, Sacred Geometry as a Divine Language. Now, as I mentioned before, I see sacred geometry as a divine language. It is the alphabet of creation. What I mean by that is, when we are kids in school we start learning how to draw each letter of the alphabet. Here is an A, here is a B. After a while you start putting the letters together and you make words. You put the words together and you make sentences, then you make paragraphs, you make entire books. The same thing is true with sacred geometry, with the patterns or the forms. Every pattern or form in sacred geometry is like a letter of the divine alphabet. Just like we put letters together to make words, so the patterns or forms come together to create specific functions, specific beings, and specific things in creation. But we have to learn this divine language one letter, i.e. one form, at a time before we start putting it all together. Here is an illustration of the front cover of a book called General Chemistry by Linus Pauling. This picture on the cover shows you a pattern that many of you are familiar with, those of you who have done particular types of trainings in New Age circles which discuss a pattern. These trainings term the Merkaba. These particular trainings discuss this form of the octahedron that you see right here, stellated out. Note, stellation is a process by which a form, a polyhedron, is modified into a star-like form. Stellation equals star dot. The form known technically as a stellated octahedron has become popularized as the concept of the Merkaba or the star tetrahedron. Over the course of this workshop, I am going to present to you some of my ideas about this mystery in a non-dogmatic fashion. You are welcome to dismiss them or incorporate them as you please. But from my perspective, and I will go into more detail on this during the week, this pattern is actually only one of the patterns of creation related to the profound Hebrew spiritual mysteries taught in the Hekaloth school, and popularized as the Merkaba mysteries. But it is not the only form. There is a whole series of forms that have different functions. So this form on the cover of this chemistry textbook is connected to profound spiritual initiation topics, as well as empirical scientific studies. In the manifest world, what we FMD is that everything has a specific geometric form. When I studied biology, chemistry, physics, everything came down to specific geometry. The geometric form of a thing determines its function. If you change the shape or the geometry, you change the function. This is very important. People who have been involved in any type of study of chemistry as related to biology in the human body know how important the shapes of these biological structures are. When they get misshapen, then all the functions begin to go haywire. In the simplest sense, things like the geometries behind crystal patterns in the manifest world, they are based on a simple set of patterns. And then in biology, as I was mentioning, the actual folding of proteins and things of that kind will give you particular functions according to the folding pattern. If it gets misfolded, then you can have very severe problems. This occurs although biological studies. The shape is extremely important. 17. Also in studies of health, you begin to find that there are specific geometric forms, not only for the things which give us health, but also things which create illness. This is an electromagnetic imaging of an adenovirus particle shown here, and this is a geometric archetype of the same pattern. The adenovirus actually has what is known as an icosahedral structure. During the week we will go into detail on all these different terminologies, and the forms they are connected to. The upshot is that viruses are based on an icosahedral shell. It is largely because of the geometry of the virus that explains why it is so hard to kill a virus. We have all types of antibacterial agents, but antivirals are much more difficult, because the actual geometric form of the virus is hard to break. So the actual viral shell that has been identified from the perspective of modern medicine is related to classical concepts in sacred geometry described in ancient Greece. Buckminster Fuller predicted this form for the virus before it was validated through empirical electromagnetic imaging, because he understood the way that the form creates function. In fact, Buckminster Fuller explained all the essential forms that scientists in nanotechnology later discovered were crucial for nanotechnology, many years before nanotechnology even existed. This topic of sacred geometric form is not an abstract thing for us, because in reality everything that we think, everything that we feel, everything that we experience in our internal life is related to these geometric forms. They create energetic effects. Now part of this is related to the human subtle body, the way the subtle body is structured. But it also has to do, again, with the actual physical structures of the physical body. You can actually look at the crystalline or geometric forms of the hormone secretions in the human body that determines how you feel. Are you happy or are you depressed? Are you healthy or are you sick? Whatever the feeling might be. This picture shows thioxin. These are the crystals that come from the secretions of the human thyroid gland. It has a very specific type of geometric shape. Whereas this picture is adrenaline, and of course, we know how powerful adrenaline is. I suspect they gave us a false color imaging and they made it bright red just to emphasize a point, but it is interesting again the way the geometry relates to the effect that these particular substances have on us. The same thing is true for all the powerful effects that we have from our sexual hormones, the things which affect us through our gender in the physical body. So we have testosterone. This picture is the geometric form of testosterone in the male body. That is how the hormone crystallizes out. Whereas for women, estriol and progesterone shown here have very specific forms. There is something crucial being expressed in the geometry of these hormones. Some of you have seen this next picture before, and if you have, please remain quiet for a moment. For those of you that have not seen this before, I am going to ask you to take a look at this geometric pattern. Therese is an archetypal blueprint of geometry for something you would see in the manifest world. I am going to ask you to just silently look at this for a moment and think, if this geometry was to manifest into 3 dimensions, into the manifest world, what would it be? I will just point out a few features while you are looking at it. Here is a 6-sided hexagonal enclosure around the form, expressing some of the harmonics of the geometry. Here is a 5-pointed star coming down from above and another interpenetrating 5-pointed star coming up from below. What is this a geometric blueprint of? The answer, it is the geometric analysis of this woman's face. In fact, all human faces are based on a common blueprint, which has the essential features of this geometric pattern. They have 18. Done studies of young infants, where they will show the child a normal face and the child is happy. There are ways that you can work with the face pattern, there are variations possible within it, but geometrically they are based on the same blueprint. But if they put the nose in the wrong place or the eyes in the wrong place on the face, then the child starts crying. The child instinctively understands what the proper geometric form should be. Also, I heard something really interesting from someone who came to one of my earlier workshops. He said, you know, every human face, if you cut it in half and put a mirror to it so that now it appears to be a whole face, every human face has a little bit of asymmetry between the 2 halves. Out of thousands of faces studied, only one face was found that had perfect bilateral symmetry, that was perfectly balanced. That is the face on the Shroud of Turin. When we understand that there are these geometric blueprints behind things in the manifest world, we can start learning what is known as pattern recognition. The significance of pattern recognition is that things are connected which normally we would never think are connected. Through a type of plotting intellectualism using only the analytical reductionist mind, you would never connect the 2 things, which are shown to be connected through pattern recognition. Here is a very important example of this. This picture shows the sacred geometry of Jerusalem. It was identified by a researcher working in Israel and then elaborated further by a British gentleman named John Mitchell in a book called The Temple at Jerusalem. Essentially, this is the form of the geometric blueprint behind Jerusalem. Let's take a closer look at some key aspects of this geometric pattern of Jerusalem. Notice how this geometry of Jerusalem has a six-sided hexagonal enclosure. Within that enclosure it has two five-pointed stars, one pointing up and one pointing down, interlocking. Having noted the six-pointed star and double five-pointed star geometry, this geometry of Jerusalem also shows this form where, as we will explain in more detail next week, a five-pointed star that is upright has an inverted five-pointed star inside of it. That is just part of natural pattern of the five-pointed star, the pentagram. Every five-pointed star naturally has an inverted pentagon in its center, which holds an inverted five-pointed star. That inverted five-pointed star has in its center an upright pentagon, containing an upright five-pointed star inside of it, and this process recurs endlessly in the pattern of every five-pointed star, as if the star is spinning into its own center. The place that happens to be the anchor in this geometric pattern of Jerusalem, the place at the very epicenter of that fractal five-pointed star movement into its own center, is in fact the Mount of Golgotha, which in Christian esotericism is the place where Christ was crucified. And for the esotericism of the entire three monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, it is the place of the burial of the skull of Adam. Golgotha means the place of the skull. It is where the first man's skull is buried. That is an essential part of the spiritual mystery of why Christ is crucified at that exact location. The place of the first man, Adam, being buried in the earth, and the place of the Messiah, Christ, being crucified leading to the spiritual resurrection of humanity, is located right here at the epicenter of the five-pointed star movement in the sacred geometry of Jerusalem. These observations of the geometry lead to some very important conclusions. The first concerns this ability of pattern recognition which we mentioned, in which two things which seem unconnected are shown through their similar geometric patterns to in fact be intimately 19. Connected. So when we compare the geometric blueprint we saw of the human face, from the book Geometry of Art and Life by Guercke, to the geometric blueprint of Jerusalem, we FMD they have almost identical geometric patterns, a hexagonal enclosure with interpenetrating five-pointed stars, one pointing up and one pointing down. So the human face and Jerusalem are based on the same pattern of creation, the same geometric blueprint or archetype. This opens the way for reflection on extremely profound spiritual realities. Note that the human face is the part of the body which we examine to see the inner nature of person. The face expresses who they are much more than any other body part. We do not look a person's elbow or lower back, for instance, to get a sense of their inner self. What does it mean that the form of the human face, which is where the human spiritual essence, the I am spiritual presence, manifests itself into expression in the most perfect way in the human body, has the same pattern as Jerusalem? The face is what you look at to know who a person is. It is spirit expressed in form. We then have in Jerusalem, this place that is constantly being fought over by the monotheistic traditions, as an expression of something similar on the face of the earth, whether you see Jerusalem as the burial place of Adam, whether you see it as the place of the crucifixion of Christ, this place on the planet has something to do with the human spirit, the human I am presence, manifesting into the material world in either case. So developing an eye for hidden geometric relationships, developing this pattern recognition ability through training in sacred geometry, is of profound importance. We have to open up our mind to see these patterns, and then nature herself will show us the hidden spiritual foundations of the world. 20. Chapter 6, Squaring the Circle. Very often in sacred geometry we deal with the term squaring the circle. Everyone needs to be aware of this concept. Square.ring. The circle essentially deals with the circle as the expression of the perfect form related to the spiritual world, whereas the square is related to the manifestation of form into the physical world. So when you square the circle, you bring the spiritual essence into physical manifestation. There are particular geometric aspects of this which we will be dealing with as we go along, regarding how these two interact so that they have the same perimeter or circumference. And one of the most famous expressions of this, of course, is the great picture by Da Vinci called Vitruvian Man, where the man is within both the form of a circle and the form of the square, both encompass the human being. Then you have work like that of Walter Russell, where he talks about the cube and the sphere being united as one, being two opposite phases of the same thing. From Russell's perspective, the cube is the sphere extended to black coldness. The sphere is the cube contracted to white incandescence. Different perspectives dealing with the same mystery, because square and circle are also cube and sphere, in the next higher dimensional level, i.e. moving from 2D to 3D. If you start putting together circles, and we will be dealing with this more as we go along as well, then you FMD that there are specific ways that circles will nest one around the other. You have one in the center, 6 around that one, then you connect up the points of all of them, and you have a hexagon. If this hexagon is looked upon as a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional object, is the form of a cube. There are all types of relationships between these geometries. 21. Chapter 7, Higher Dimensions. So let's talk for a minute about dimensional movement. With dimensional movement, we have that whole question of how a lower dimensional form becomes a higher dimensional form. The majority of what we are going to do regarding higher dimensions is going to be around Thursday rather than now, because it is a fairly complex topic. But to get a sense of it, most of what is dealt with in sacred geometry related to higher dimensions uses as a metaphor the movement from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. So the circle becomes a sphere. The triangle becomes a tetrahedron. A square becomes a cube. People often use the term flatland as a conceptual metaphor related to higher dimensions. Flatland was a book published back in the 1880s. It is a very interesting description of how a being that was two-dimensional would perceive a three-dimensional world, using this as a metaphor for how we as three-dimensional beings would perceive a fourth-dimensional object and how it would interact with us on this 3D plane. After this book came out, spiritual circles throughout Europe began to use the metaphor of the fourth dimension as a way to explain spiritual phenomena. So one of the things you find in the late 1800s are descriptions like this. Here you have 2 rings, and you want to interlock the 2, but the 2 are solid. The solution has to do with moving through the 4th dimension. Then you can actually lock the 2 together, because by adding a higher dimension you can actually move one ring around and back in. Just like if I am on a 2-dimensional plane and I have an obstacle here, and I am moving from point A to point B, I can't cross the obstacle. If I add in the 3rd dimension, then I can go right over it. It is the same concept. So there are different ways we can work with this idea of moving through dimensions. During the week we are going to be dealing with projective geometry, which relates to that points, lines and planes create everything in our world. It is really very simple. You have a point, you have a line, and you have a plane. The point is 0-dimensional. It does not have any extent in physical space, in dimensionality. The line is 1-dimensional, it has 1 dimension of movement. The plane is 2-dimensional, like a square. And then you have a solid, like a cube, coming out in 3 dimensions. Points, lines and planes can thus be used to understand dimensional movement. You can have an initial point, and then you just add another point and you have a line, movement from 0 dimensions to 1 dimension. You can add another point, connect them up and you have a triangle, moves to 2 dimensions. You add another point and you get what is known as a tetrahedron, moves to 3 dimensions. Again, this, shown on the screen, is a 2-dimensional image of a 3-dimensional object. The tetrahedron is like a pyramid, but all the sides are triangles and it only has 3 sides up top. Then you add another point and you connect it together and you get a 4th-dimensional object, that in a 2-dimensional projection looks like a 5-pointed star. Remember what I said about pattern recognition: things that you would not normally relate to one another are revealed to have relationships. So one perspective on the 5-pointed star is that it has to do with dimensional movement, as shown here in a particular point progression. And you see how that works in that type of projection. This type of projection is based on creating dimensions by adding additional points and then just connecting the points together, to enclose space or to enclose hyperspace. But you could also do the same thing by adding lines, instead of points. So you have a line, and then you move the line parallel to itself and connect it up into one form. This line could also be seen as an axis or a vector. What I mean by that is, an axis is 23. Just like a particular line that runs through the center of an object. If this is an axis, I can spin this form on its axis, like the Earth spinning. A vector is like a line of movement. I am moving in a vector line in this direction. So this could be an axis, it could be a vector, it could be a line, but you get 2 of them and then you get the form creating the square. You add another line /axis/vector in and it creates the form we will be describing later as an octahedron. It is like 2 pyramids connected base to base. Now with that form, if you see it as being a projection, it looks like a 6-pointed star, hexagram. Then if you move it to add in another line or a dimensional vector, you get the form of a 4th-dimensional object and it looks like the form of an 8-pointed star or an octagram. So again, some forms that we see as 2-dimensional objects can be related to higher dimensions through this type of projection. We are going to keep it very simple for the moment. Then if we do the same thing with planes, point, line, plane, then we move the plane out away from itself and then join the 2 planes together. The whole concept here is that we are working in such a fashion that the thing itself is being doubled. Point to point creates a line, then line to line connect the 2 lines with more lines and it creates a square. Project the square out away from itself and then connect up the 2 squares with more squares to enclose space and you get a cube. Project the cube away from itself, connect the 2 cubes together with more cubes. This requires a higher dimensional space, i.e. a 4th dimension, and you get the form of a hypercube, which again we see has an 8-pointed star inside of it. So dimensional movement can be looked at a number of different ways, through different progressions and projections. The main thing I want you to take from it at the moment is this idea of building up dimensions through different progressions. 24. Chapter 8, The 3-Dimensional World and the Cube of Space. This picture shows the 3 axes of space and the cube of space, the classic representation which you will see in many different spiritual traditions to express the 3 axes of physical space, which are simply length, depth, and breadth. These are the 3 axes in a 3-dimensional form. These 3 axes are what would fit inside of a cube if you were to connect up all of the faces. So there is something called the cube of space that different traditions talk about, which has to do with holding these 3 axes within the cube. If you want to represent these 3 axes 2-dimensionally, then you have the form of a cross, but then to represent the 3rd axis, since you are doing it on a flat plane, you have to just draw a crossed line like that. We are going to see this appear in a number of different ways in different traditions. For instance, it is related to the form that you see with emblems of the Christ in the first Christian centuries. And it is related to things in the Hebrew Kabbalah, where they talk about the different letters of the Hebrew alphabet having different properties. The 3 mother letters in the Hebrew alphabet are related to the 3 axes of physical space. There is a tremendous amount of information embedded in spiritual traditions about dimensional movement and creating space through different forms. 25. Chapter 9, the cosmic context of space and time. So at this point, what we are doing is going through a number of concepts that are fundamental for many different traditions. Some things we will look at later, and there could be some things idiosyncratic to a particular tradition. But these things we are currently examining are really universal for all of these major spiritual traditions. So we